Picture an ancient human, not a cartoon caveman, not the hunched, grunting creature from a movie, a real one. Same brain as yours, same hunger, same capacity for craving something the moment you smell it, or eating past the point of fullness just because it tastes good. Now picture that person stepping into a modern supermarket for the first time. The smells hit first: bread baking, sugar caramelizing, fried food from somewhere near the back. Then the sheer volume of it, aisle after aisle of food that requires no hunting, no foraging, no effort of any kind. Just reach out and take it. His brain, built by hundreds of thousands of years of scarcity, would treat this as the greatest windfall in the history of his species. Now here's the real question. Not how he'd react emotionally. The real question is biological. Given unlimited access to food, given the exact same body he's always had, could that ancient human become obese? Because here's what most people believe: ancient humans were lean because they were always moving. They hunted, they walked, they were basically prehistoric athletes. And we are their soft, sedentary descendants who traded the spear for the sofa. It's a clean story, it makes intuitive sense, and it's mostly wrong. Here's what actually happened. Let's start with the baseline. Ancient humans, the hunter-gatherers who lived before agriculture, were not obese. We know this not from skeletons, which don't reliably preserve body fat, but from the closest thing we have to a living control group, the handful of hunter-gatherer populations still living traditional lifestyles today. Herman Pontzer, a researcher at Duke University, spent years measuring the actual biology of the Hadza people in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. What he found was striking. Hadza adults averaged a body mass index of around 20. Their body fat percentage was roughly half of what's typical in Western countries. Obesity prevalence among them was less than 5%, and it wasn't because they were moving more. Pontzer's team used a technique called doubly labeled water to measure actual daily energy expenditure and found that the Hadza burned roughly the same number of calories per day as sedentary Western adults, once body size was controlled for. That finding confused people when it was published. How is that possible? A Hadza woman who walks miles across the savannah, digs tubers out of hard African soil, and hauls water in the heat burns the same calories as someone who drives to an office and sits for 8 hours? The answer is metabolic adaptation. The body isn't a simple machine that outputs more energy the harder you push it. It's more like a very cautious accountant. If you start spending more on one line, physical activity, the body quietly finds cuts somewhere else to keep the total budget identical. The Hadza have lower resting metabolic rates than Westerners when adjusted for body size. Their immune activity runs slightly leaner. Certain cellular maintenance processes dial back. The total daily burn ends up nearly identical because the body is constantly balancing the books. This is not a flaw. This is evolution protecting you in a world where calories were never guaranteed. But it also means something important. The Hadza aren't lean because they move more and therefore burn more. They were leaner almost entirely because of what they ate, and crucially, how much of it was available. So ancient humans almost certainly weren't obese. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because while they weren't obese, their bodies were absolutely built with the capacity to become obese. And the reason why is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of human biology. In 1962, a geneticist at the University of Michigan named James Neel proposed what became known as the thrifty gene hypothesis. His argument was simple. Ancient humans lived in a world of feast and famine. When food was available, the humans who could store it most efficiently as fat were more likely to survive the lean seasons that followed. So evolution selected for genes that made fat storage fast and easy. In the modern world where food is available everywhere and the famine never comes, those same genes are now slowly killing us. It's a compelling theory. For decades, it was widely accepted. There's one significant problem with it. The evidence doesn't actually support it. In 2016, researchers at the University of Aberdeen analyzed 115 genes known to be associated with obesity. If the thrifty gene hypothesis were correct, most of those genes should show clear evidence of positive selection, meaning evolution actively favored them. Instead, only 9 out of 115 showed any sign of being selected for. 5 of those 9 were selected in the opposite direction, not for fat storage, for leanness. If evolution was aggressively building us to store fat, you'd expect to see the opposite of this. The genetic signature isn't there, and the physical evidence from archaeology backs this up in a way that's almost uncomfortably clear. When researchers examine skeletal remains from Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations, the picture is one of generally impressive health. Bone density is high. Teeth show minimal cavities because refined sugars weren't part of the diet. There's no skeletal evidence of the chronic joint stress associated with carrying excess body weight for decades. Then agriculture happens. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began settling, growing crops, storing grain, and the skeletal record shifts almost immediately. Average height drops in some populations by several inches within just a few generations. Cavities appear with suddenly high frequency. Signs of nutritional deficiency show up in bone tissue. Evidence of chronic illness increases as populations crowd into settlements. For the first time in human history, a narrower diet dominated by a single local grain replaced the varied, naturally balanced diet of the forager. Agriculture gave us surplus. It gave us the ability to predict next year's calorie supply. But the immediate physiological cost was real. And crucially, it removed, for the first time, the most fundamental biological constraint that had been keeping human body weight in check: scarcity. But here's something stranger. Even before agriculture, even in the middle of what should have been an era of lean, mobile hunter-gatherers, the archaeological record throws up something that stopped you cold. About 35,000 years ago, someone carved a small figurine from limestone and left it near the Danube River in what is now Austria. It was discovered in 1908, and it's now one of the most famous objects in human history, the Venus of Willendorf. She is unmistakably obese. Large breasts, heavy abdomen, thick thighs, rolls of fat visible across her torso. And she is not alone. Across Europe, from France to Russia, archaeologists have found dozens of nearly identical figurines, all depicting women with the same body type, all carved between 38,000 and 14,000 years ago. For a long time, these were dismissed as fertility symbols. But in 2020, Professor Richard Johnson at the University of Colorado published a detailed analysis of every known Venus figurine and found something remarkable. The degree of obesity depicted in each figurine was directly correlated with how close it was to a glacier. The colder the climate, the more extreme the body depicted. When the glaciers retreated and food became more available, the figurines got leaner. His conclusion was that these weren't fertility symbols. They were survival symbols, carved and displayed during periods of extreme nutritional stress, during what may have been some of the worst famines in human prehistory, as a representation of something that was rare, aspirational, and life-saving, enough body fat to survive the winter. In other words, the ancient humans who carved these weren't celebrating obesity as normal. They were depicting it as an almost unattainable ideal during a period of starvation. Fat, in that world, was precious. It was life. So back to the question, could ancient humans become obese? Almost certainly not in the way we experience it today. The combination of low caloric density food, the unpredictability of supply, and the social practice of sharing meat equally across the group meant there was simply no practical pathway to sustained excess weight. The food environment didn't allow it, but the capacity was always there. The biology was always there. The brain circuits that make fat taste good, that make sugar irresistible, that reward calorie-dense food with dopamine, those were there. They were just never triggered at the scale they're triggered today. Which brings us back to why the modern obesity epidemic isn't really about ancient genes doing something new. It's about what happened to the food. Natural food, even rich natural food, engages your satiety signals. The fat in wild salmon triggers hormonal responses that tell your brain you've eaten enough. The protein in game meat is satiating. The fiber in tubers slows digestion. The variety of textures and flavors in a natural diet creates what researchers call sensory-specific satiety, the natural tendency to stop wanting a food once you've genuinely had enough of it. A piece of salmon is filling. You can only eat so much before your body signals it's done. You cannot say the same about a bag of chips, because the chip was specifically engineered not to trigger that satiety signal. Food scientists call it the bliss point, the precise combination of fat, sugar, and salt that maximizes the brain's reward response while minimizing the feeling of fullness. It's not accidental. Processed food companies spent decades and enormous resources calibrating this ratio specifically to make the next chip feel just as appealing as the first, because your reward circuitry never quite receives the satisfaction signal it was promised. The ancient world never produced a bliss point food. Nature had no incentive to prevent you from feeling full. Only an industry that profits from your continued consumption has that incentive. And here's the clearest proof that this is a food environment problem, not a genetics problem. It played out in real time on a single population within 2 generations. The Pima people of Arizona lived for thousands of years as farmers and foragers in the Sonoran Desert. They were lean, they were active, they had no obesity epidemic. Their bodies had adapted over generations to a desert environment where calories were hard-won and the system had to run efficiently. Then, in the late 19th century, upstream settlers diverted the rivers the Pima relied on for irrigation. Their traditional farming systems collapsed. The U.S. government stepped in with food assistance programs. The food supplied was dominated by refined flour, lard, canned goods, and sugar. Within 1 or 2 generations, an evolutionary instant, the Pima developed some of the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes ever recorded in a human population, rates that had no precedent anywhere in their history. But here's the detail that makes this a genuine scientific proof, rather than just a sad story. Their relatives, the Pima who lived across the border in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, the same ethnic group, the same ancient lineage, the same ancestral DNA, had continued eating a traditional diet. They remained significantly leaner and metabolically healthier than their Arizona counterparts. Same genetics. Different food environment. Completely different outcome. The thrifty gene didn't cause obesity. The removal of the food environment that kept the thrifty gene in check did. So could ancient humans become obese? The honest answer is, probably not. But not for the reason most people think. Not because they had different genetics, because they had different food. And the moment the food changed, around 10,000 years ago with agriculture, and then dramatically again with industrial food processing, the bodies that were never meant to live in abundance started showing exactly what happens when the famine never comes. Your body didn't betray you. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. It just wasn't built for this. And maybe that's why so many modern habits feel impossible to break, not because of weakness, but because the system running underneath them is hundreds of thousands of years old. But that raises another question. If your brain is always craving, always scanning, always wanting more, when does it actually get to stop? And when it finally does, what happens inside it?